Well, welcome, guys, and thank you so much for coming to this incredible event that we've got on tonight. I've got none other than the amazing Dr. Paul Clayton, very dear and personal friend to myself and also to the Zenzino world, and in fact to a lot of people out there that he's assisted with these incredible products that he's brought to market and the products that he's been involved with. And Dr. Paul, there's probably two of the key products I'm going to talk about tonight is the Zenzino Balanced Oil and the Zenzino Balanced Test. First up, what I'd like you to do, Dr. Paul, is just give the people on the line a quick 1-minute history snap of your background and also how you got introduced to the balanced oil.
Well, let me tell you what I'm not. I'm not a nutritionist. I'm in fact a pharmacologist, a clinical pharmacologist. So this involved my going to medical school, which I did back in 1968, and went all the way through to collecting a PhD in neuropharmacology. But already, even back in the 60s, I was starting to get more interested in the world of, you might call it natural pharmacology, because even back then it was becoming evident that pharmaceutical pharmacology was going to be great at alleviating the symptoms of diseases, but apart from the antibiotics, it produces no cures, whereas natural pharmacology, the pharmacology of food and food derivatives, could do just that. So I became involved in this very early. I was one of the first people to start looking at the pharmacology of food. And, jumped forward half a century, a little bit more than that, in fact, to the time when I was advising a lot of companies in the supplement space. And one of them, a company called Oil for Life, based in Norway, approached me and asked me to advise them and help them with a product which was the forerunner of balance oil. And this was a combination of fish oil and olive oil. We very quickly found that this was far more effective than fish oil on its own. And we then collaborated with the universities of Milan in Italy and Tromsø and Trondheim in Norway to develop a DBS test, the dried blood spot test, which is an old technology, but we brought it bang up to date. And with a couple of drops of blood, we can produce, or rather not us, but VITAS, which is an independent, it's a third-party forensic analytical company. They can produce a readout on your lipidomics. And the importance of that is it tells us how likely you are to develop chronic inflammatory stress. Now, first, two things. That has a huge prognostic value because it tells us what your risk might be of developing a number of very serious conditions. But it's also something where we can show that if you do take balance oil, we move the needle. You can see the results changing over a fairly short period of time, 3 to 4 months. And what we very quickly found after that was that as your ratio of 6s to 3s decreases, symptoms start to become less. They then, in many cases, disappear altogether. And at the end of this process, a surprisingly high percentage of people become no longer dependent on pharmaceuticals because the underlying condition has, to a very large extent, or perhaps completely, resolved. Now, this is a huge claim to make. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and we're generating that right now. We've moved well further from the simple collection of case histories. We have tens of thousands, but that's poor level data. And we're involved in an increasing number of prospective randomized clinical trials. We publish a lot, more papers coming out this year. And I think what we are doing is establishing the science of pharmaconutrition, which is succeeding where pharmaceutical medicine and supplements fail.
And Paul, the great thing that I believe, and what I've been around now about 4.5 years, nearly 5 years with the company Zenzino, but it's this little white box that gets delivered to all of our customers called our Premier Kit. And inside that kit is the balance test, obviously as the forerunner of day one for starting the program, and then your first month or 2 months supply of the product. I want to talk about tonight in yeah, a little bit of detail, and you ask yourself which one comes first, the test or the oil. But we're just ticking over right now, which you probably know. We've done 1 million tests now, okay, through Vitis Laboratories now. That's fully recorded, which is quite amazing when you think about it. I want to talk about that, okay, in detail, and then obviously the balanced oil, and then the premium balanced oil. So a lot of people like to know the real difference between the balanced oil and then the premium balanced oil. So you can pick on the chicken or the egg, which one you want to talk about first. Tell me, in your opinion, obviously the way the domino effect should fall, and then if you can talk to me about some of the technology that's in these products.
Okay, this chicken and egg metaphor is always problematic. Where do you start? It's a circle. We can talk about the test very briefly, and we do use it routinely to determine whether someone actually is going to benefit from the balanced oil or not. If you do a test and you have a good result, we will say to you, you don't need us. Goodbye. Have a wonderful day and a healthy life, and we'll give you the money back for the test. You didn't need it in the first place. We don't believe in medicalizing people who are fundamentally healthy. I don't think we should do that. I don't think any company should do that. We find, though, that probably the majority of people, thanks to the modern diet, which has really gone very badly wrong, and you can see that in our worsening public health, the majority of people do have bad results. And then when they see that, they can decide whether or not they want to do something about it. If they do want to improve their lipid profiles and their health prospects, then that's where balanced oil comes in. It'll change the lipid profile, it'll change your symptom score, it'll change your health prospects. I mean, this is kind of beyond debate now. You're right when you say we've done 1 million tests. It's a vast number. This is done all over the world. And it's probably 100 times larger than anybody else's database. I mean, we have become the world's leading experts in this area by a long streak. Now, you talked about balanced oil and premium oil. What is the difference? Well, the rate at which we can change the chemistry of your cell membranes is, we can't affect that because that's limited by some very fundamental biological processes that we can't speed up or slow down. I don't think anybody would know how to do that. This is a part of how cells function. But for someone who has got very problematic symptoms, perhaps very acute symptoms, or where there is a very serious health issue, we might recommend the premium oil because that has a higher content of these very, very interesting amphiphilic polyphenols, which we derive from olive. Now, the point about using amphiphilic polyphenols is, firstly, they are more effective at achieving good secondary bioavailability. That is, they will increase the rate at which you can incorporate some omega-3s into the cell membrane. But more than that, the polyphenols themselves, these particular polyphenols, and it's very rare amongst polyphenols that this occurs, but these ones are stored in the body and they have potent anti-inflammatory effects of their own. So if you want to initiate a strong anti-inflammatory effect earlier on, then you would use the premium product to achieve that.
So, Paul, you read on the label, okay, and you see omega-3, 6, 7, 9, and 11. Those core omegas, the formulation on the way it's been put together from the original product to where it is today. Talk to me about the benefits, okay? And because we see on the box, okay, we talk about the heart, the brain, the immune system. What are the key benefits, without going into the gray zone too much, okay? What are the key benefits that people are seeing from boosting their 3s up to where they should be, okay, and combating those 6s?
Well, you're absolutely right. The omega-3s are essential for immune, central nervous system function, and the function, in fact, of every tissue in the body. The problem is fish oils can't seem to do that on their own, and the reason is they don't have the right chaperones in them. What we can achieve is the integration of these omega-3s into your cell membranes, and when that happens, you start to wind down chronic inflammatory stress. Now, what does that actually mean for the individual? But it depends on what your symptoms were to begin with. Now, if I just talk about lifestyle conditions, or what people refer to as diseases of civilization, and I don't want to get too specific here because the law will not allow it. A lot of those problems are driven by chronic inflammatory stress. And if you could find a way of switching off chronic inflammatory stress without causing a whole range of serious side effects that you see, for example, with steroids or with the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, and without causing immunosuppression, which some of the chemotherapeutic drugs do, and the strong immunosuppressants do, like the steroids, that would be a pretty wonderful thing, because at that point you start reducing the risk of many of these lifestyle conditions and problems without a downside, without actually harming your patients or your contacts in the meantime. This is something that we've been looking for as long as I can remember, ever since I was at medical school. And as I said, that goes back to 1968. So it's been a long old time. This has been a bit of a breakthrough. No, let me rephrase that. It's been a breakthrough. The ability to be able to manage these conditions without harming our patients has been a step change in healthcare in general. And that's equally true whether you're talking about patients and subjects who are in primary healthcare, who are in secondary healthcare, who've been admitted to hospital, who are in tertiary and quaternary healthcare. But it's also true for those people who are in the community who don't yet know that they have a slowly developing chronic degenerative condition, and where, if we can reconfigure their metabolism, we'll get them to the point where that condition will not develop and it will not progress. And then we can save these people from having to enter the healthcare system in the first place. There's a lot of evidence that this is possible. I know that it is, in fact, from my own personal experience. But there are many other lines of evidence that we derive from many other areas. And for anyone who's interested and wants to look more at the nuts and bolts of this, because as a pharmacologist, I obsessively study how these things work and why they do what they do, then please visit my blog, which is drpaulclayton.eu. That's drpaulclayton.eu. And there you'll see post after post after post looking at the way in which nutrition and food derivatives interact with and can modify and improve our health.
Now you see on there as well, Paul, that we list vitamin D. What was the reason why we added that in as well? Because there's obviously some debates about vitamin D and whether we get too much because we're out in the sun too much or whatever, depending on what country, what region of the world you're in. Talk to me about why that was added and when you had that point of bringing vitamin D into it as well.
The reason for that is very simple. We looked at the surveys studying vitamin D status in different populations, and it turns out that whether you're talking about the temperate zones or the subtropical regions or even the tropical regions, hypervitaminosis D, that is excessively low levels of vitamin D, are the rule. That very few people have what are considered to be optimal levels of vitamin D. There's various reasons for this. If you live in the temperate zones, then for most of the year, the sunlight just isn't strong enough to be able to produce enough vitamin D in the skin. Can I just say that when I talk about vitamin D, it's not really a vitamin, because unlike other vitamins, you can obtain it from certain foods, such as oily fish and egg yolks and things like that. It's actually, it's an hormone, it's a vitamin, it's a nutrient, it's all of those things. So it's a bit of an anomalous compound. Nonetheless, in the temperate zones, the vast majority of people are low in vitamin D. You'd think it would be better in the subtropical areas and in the tropical areas, but on the whole, it isn't. And the reason for that is that in industrialized and industrializing societies, fewer and fewer people are working out of doors in the fields. And what that means is that we're spending our working hours indoors, behind glass, inside buildings of one sort of another. We're not making vitamin D. And in addition, there have been a whole series of government warnings for people to avoid too much exposure to direct sunlight, because we're all suddenly very worried about skin cancer. That's a very complicated issue. we never used to be that vulnerable to skin cancer, even although we used to spend far more time outdoors. I'm going back 3, 4, and 5 generations, because the diet that we consumed at that period was full of very protective compounds, which meant they, amongst other things, carotenoids and polyphenols and various other things that migrated into the skin and gave you a kind of an internal sunblock and an internal protection against cutaneous inflammation. The modern diet has stripped all those away, and so we have become much more vulnerable to sunlight. So I do understand the reason why so many governments have advocated this sunshine avoidance strategy. But the downside of that is that it has contributed to hypovitaminosis D, that is excessively low vitamin D levels worldwide. And this is now related to an increased risk of a very wide range of very serious health conditions. So we put a little bit of vitamin D back into the bottle.
Fantastic. And Paul, as we know with some of the core chronic diseases that are out there right now, and we're talking about diabetes, heart stroke, Alzheimer's, ADHD, all of these common ones that are, and I call them man-made diseases because they are man-made diseases. Back in the historian days, we didn't have those type of issues. People used to walk miles to work and they used to do laboring all the time. And now we sit behind an AI machine and put together a whole marketing program. Things have changed dramatically, and we're seeing more and more of this. And again, as wellness professionals, yourself and myself, I don't want to go into the gray zone, but can we just touch on what we've seen? Now, I've personally seen some amazing results in the last 4.5, 5 years of people that have taken the balance test using the Ascent oil or the balanced oil, okay, depending on which country you're listening to on this recording. But talk to me about some of the things that you would say, like the people with diabetes, the people with rheumatoid arthritis, ADHD, some of the things you've seen as well that you can openly say.
Well, let me comment, first of all, on one of the points that you raised. These are man-made diseases. Well, there's some truth in that, but it's not entirely true, because we know of cases of heart disease and cancer and dementia that were happening a century ago and 10 centuries ago. We can tell that from, the archaeological remains, but they were rare. That's the point. Mm-hmm. In the mid-Victorian era, this is in the period 1850 to 1900, which is a period I've studied, these conditions were known, they were recognized, but they were occurring at a level of about 10% of the levels we see today, in a population that had the same kind of life expectancy that we do. So what seems to have happened is that the numbers of people coming down with these conditions have absolutely exploded. They've increased 10 times. And from that pattern, we draw 2 lessons. One of those is that about 90% of the burden of public health, of these terrible conditions, is avoidable. And that's where, we specialize in finding ways of avoiding them. And conversely, if you go back 150 years or so, the 10% of the population who were developing those diseases were probably doing so because they had strong genetic risk factors. And that is something you'll hear me talk about again and again. When you ask specialists these days, whether it's an oncologist or a cardiologist or whatever, or a neurogeriatrician, how many of their patients have strong genetic risk factors, the answer is usually the same, about 10%. And I think what that is telling us is that there's a hard core of about 10% of people who have always had these conditions, who always will. But there's an additional 90% in whom the conditions have been largely man-made or created by the environment, not by their genes. And those are the people where we can help. So that's the first point. In terms of describing the sorts of things that I've seen, the law makes it very difficult to talk openly about this. The law makes it, in fact, illegal to be honest. That's the situation we are in now, because unfortunately, the pharmaceutical industry is so very powerful and so very wealthy that they have largely corrupted or co-opted, you might say, the regulatory system and the legal system. And it has made it absolutely illegal for us to tell you what our types of interventions can achieve. I find this incredibly frustrating as a scientist, as a fourth generation scientist, in fact. I'm very committed to exploring the factual evidence, whatever it might say, and then extrapolating from that and presenting it to people and showing them how they can benefit from it, if that's at all possible. That's my prime motivation. Yes, I find now that if I do try to do that, I risk being put in jail and having the entire company shut down. All I can tell you is that I've seen a very large number of lives being absolutely changed by this type of intervention. People who were in a very poor shape, who had given up, whose friends and family, and in many cases their doctors, had given up on them. And what we see is that when you restore proper traditional nutritional values, which is what our tools do, these people, very many of them, experience a new lease of life. And I'm terribly sorry that I cannot say more than that.
And Paul, I know you've just completed a tour through Europe and through the UK. A lot of those people that you had the opportunity of talking to, or actually speaking to, were actually wellness professionals of some type, be it doctors, be it naturopaths, be it chiropractors, be it in that wellness professional field. I know that a number of those were absolutely just going crazy at you and saying, I can't believe the results of the balance test, the Ascent oil, the balanced oil, the results that they're getting in clinic with patients. And like you just said, with everyday people. Can you talk about that tour a little bit, about some of the people you had the opportunity of actually working with and talking to?
We were talking to not only what the Germans call Heilpraktikanten, so these are basically nutritionists or nutritional therapists, but an increasing number of orthodox medics, including some very senior ones. So a bunch of professors, heads of clinical and academic departments were coming along. And it's taken a while to get to this point, because in the early days, the message that we were giving really ran very much counter to medical orthodoxy. I mean, when I first introduced the term pharmaconutrition, this was back in the late 70s. And I remember talking to an audience of, I think, 26 or 27 very well-known professors, and saying, this is what I think it is, and being ridiculed. I mean, now there are university departments in pharmaconutrition, but it's been a long haul to get to this point. When I started talking about what one could achieve by switching off, for example, chronic inflammatory stress using balance oil, again, the reception from many doctors who weren't already practicing natural medicine or orthomolecular medicine was skeptical. And then what tends to happen is the doctor will then come across a patient who they've been managing for years, sometimes decades, keeping going with pharmaceuticals, not curing, but just keeping going. And then one day the patient comes back and says to the doctor, well, I don't need these medications you're giving me anymore. And the doctor tests them and says, oh, you don't seem to have this condition or that condition anymore. Well, these things happen. Medical miracles happen. And the doctor will then brush it under the carpet and go on about his or her day as if really nothing untoward had happened at all. And then they'll see a second patient getting better, someone that they've known for years, and suddenly who they find, well, they no longer need medical attention anymore because they don't have the condition. And at that point, even the most boneheaded of doctors will say, well, okay, there's a certain amount of smoke here. Could there be a fire? And this is what I've seen, I've heard from a number of doctors. They then say, oh, well, I've got an expendable relative I could give this to, like, a remote cousin or an eccentric older aunt, or it might be, and they'll use them as a guinea pig because they think, well, there's nothing to lose. And they find that this person gets better as well. And then what happens in a surprising number of cases, you have to remember that doctors are human. They get sick too. In fact, their life expectancy is a little shorter than average because they have so much access to pharmaceuticals. And they get sick, and sometimes they try these products for themselves. And then they notice that they get being cured of whatever it was that they were trying to treat in the first place. And at that point, they become quite messianic about it because that is to them very convincing. I have to say, as a scientist, that's terrible evidence. I was talking about individual case histories and extrapolating from there to a more general scientific case. You shouldn't do. But doctors are human. They get better. They think, oh, something really is happening here. And then they come and talk to us. We're then able, in confidence and not on record, to take them through the scientific evidence, step by step, show them the pharmacology. And at that point, they say, oh, can we do a clinical trial with you? And I'm being besieged at the moment by medical personnel who want to do clinical trials using our pharmaconutritional tools. And we're actually having to pick and choose very carefully as to which ones we work with.
And I think, Paul, that's the interesting fact, because even from my side in the Southern Hemisphere, I have a lot of wellness professional doctors, IVF, which you're talking to some of the key people at IVF Australia, Rheumatoid Arthritis Solutions Australia. The list just goes on some of the big players that are working with us on, obviously, the oils and their patients and the balance test. But the mindset of a person that can see or hear what we're doing, but then they have this fear because it's a direct sales company. We have an army of wellness professionals that are taking this product globally, basically because of the results in clinic. Could you sort of have a comment for those people that may have a fear? I know there's a number of people from India, there's practitioners on the call from India, for an example. If they had a fear that was like that, or if anybody listening around the world had a fear that's a wellness professional, what would you say to those people about the balanced oil and the balanced test?
Well, I think in some cases, those fears are justified, particularly in North America, where the role of the doctor, particularly if he or she is working inside a secondary or tertiary healthcare system, they're very circumscribed. The diagnoses that they make are based on algorithms, which are handed down to them by the medical group they're working within. And then the treatments that they're allowed to prescribe and recommend, again, are couched in another, that's the diagnostic algorithm. They now have a treatment algorithm that they have to work with. And they're very nervous about stepping outside the bounds of those frameworks for fear of lawsuits. So I absolutely do understand their concerns. Frankly, I wouldn't want to work as a doctor in that kind of system. It's incredibly restricting. And what I'm seeing now are increasing numbers of doctors who are refusing to do this and who are going, they're no longer battery doctors, they're becoming free range, and they go out, they set up their practices, and they say to their customers, well, I will be a concierge doctor, sign this document saying you won't sue me, and I will then be able to do my best for you. As opposed to remaining captured by the pharmaceutical industry, which is what happens to most hospital doctors. I think you've seen how some of those doctors who've stepped outside the mainstream narrative with COVID, for example, have been railroaded and pilloried by industry and politicians as a result, because you're talking about interfering with the profit making of a very important group of industries. So the pharmaceutical industry, the health insurance industry, and the politicians who basically act as parasites on the backs of these industries. You can't go up against them and not expect to have to pay a price. I think for other doctors who are not working in a system like that, I would say something rather different. I would say, firstly, well, there isn't actually nothing to fear. We're talking about moving outside the Pasteurian frame of reference that you were taught at medical school. But what you will see if you decide to integrate these types of tools into your practice, you'll see that your patients will do better. They don't interact in any negative way with any pharmaceuticals that you're currently using, with one exception, which we can come back to. They will very likely reduce the doses and the necessity for the pharmaceuticals. They will, in some cases, protect against the adverse effects that those pharmaceuticals can create. And you will find that some of your patients over time will become less pharmaceutically dependent as well. And that's a very basic shift that most doctors find difficult to understand in the beginning. But once they've seen it in a couple of their patients, they see the light and they start to think, Well, this is something that we can very usefully integrate into our medical practice. Now, could I just say, for the benefit of all those doctors in the audience, I'm not against pharmaceutical pharmacology. It absolutely has its place. It has its place in the acute and emergency management of symptoms. If a patient comes to you with pain or suffering or disability, as part of our duty of care, we want to try to relieve the symptoms of pain and disability. And pharmaceuticals are very good at doing that. What they are not good at doing is managing symptoms over the longer haul. What they are hopeless at doing is curing. So I'm not suggesting that you throw your pharmaceutical products away, but they should not be at the center, front and center of your management models and schemes. They should be there as a backdrop. They should be, I believe, there to manage those individuals for whom pharmaconutrition does not work. Now, I've already said pharmaconutrition will work in the vast majority. The evidence suggests about 80, 85, even 90% of cases. But some cases will always come through. They're the ones probably with strong genetic risk factors. They will require symptomatic management, which is basically all that pharmaceuticals can do.
So with that, I know that there is a major shift moving towards test-based nutrition. In other words, being able to diagnose in clinic or with a patient through an independent device, which is the balance test in this particular case. On that test, you see there's 3, 4, 5 key points. And the core one that I always talk about, or that people talk to me about, is the cell membrane fluidity. Can you talk to me about that one specific point on the balance test, or some of the key points in the balance test? Because I do believe it's just the circle that comes around. The test is day 1, 120 days on the oil, do another test. And then how often should you do another balance test? Well, I think every year you should be doing another test to check your cells and how the structure is working. Can I have your feedback on that?
Well, I think with regard to scheduling the testing, because that's an easy question, let me deal with it first. At point of entry, when you first start exploring this issue, find out whether you have a problem or not. If you do, get on board, use the pharmaconutritional tools, check yourself again at 4 months, because by then you should see a huge reconfiguration in your lipid profile. And then I think doing it once a year after that is probably quite reasonable. It's just a form of very straightforward and very easy monitoring that you can use to check where you are. When it comes to what the test actually shows, well, it shows you the percentages of a dozen or so of the main lipids that you have circulating in your blood at any one time. We look at the 6:3 ratio, which is very important in determining whether or not you are likely to have chronic inflammatory stress. We look at the omega-3 index, which is looking at the, in a more quantitative way, at the amount of omega-3s you have in your cell membranes. And both of those are important in determining, as I say, your risk of having chronic inflammatory stress. The membrane fluidity parameter is a little bit different. That is an algorithm, which, I mean, we didn't develop that. It relates to the percentage of saturated fatty acids in your cell membranes and polyunsaturated, whether it's 6s or 3s. In fact, it's both. Because when you have saturated fatty acids in the cell membranes, they pack very close together in the membrane, and that is a membrane that tends to be not very flexible. It's relatively rigid. The more of the polyunsaturates you have in your cell membranes, they have got different structures. And when they bound together, the binding is rather loose, the packing is less tight, the cell membrane is more fluid as a result. And cells, for example, red blood cells, will move more easily through the capillaries. The idea that a flexible cell membrane will it'll make it easier for a cell to take up nutrients and excrete waste products it makes sense from a theoretical point of view. I sort of think, well, that probably is what happens. Is it clinically important? The answer is, I don't think anybody knows. It was added to the outputs of the test because, as I said, this algorithm had been designed and people were talking about it. But I think for most people, it's really more of a theoretical number. It's of interest to academics like me, and there's many other people who specialize in this far more than I do, but I'm not convinced that it has immediate clinical relevance to most people. So I'm sorry, that's not a very clear answer. It might not be the answer you're looking for, but I think that's where the scientific consensus is at the moment.
Yeah, fantastic. But the with the result that it gives you, or the markers, let's call it a marker in this particular, because that's what I say, it's your day one marker. It gives you a control of your own health or own cellular system in the 22-page report. It details enough information for you to then take a proactive approach towards your health. And this is what I'm finding with all the wellness people in the Southern Hemisphere, that they're really just seeing that, and they can make some quicker decisions on the blood test, the dry blood testing that the report gives them, to get them onto, as you said, a program that's going to benefit them, not actually disadvantage them.
Well, evidence-based nutrition is key. We've had there's a large supplements industry which sells this, that, and the other, most of which doesn't really work. And people have taken it on faith, these products. The supplement companies who sell them, clearly in most cases, don't know what they're selling. The people who are buying them don't exactly know what they're buying. It's a terrible business model. What we're trying to do is to recapitulate something that's happened in the world of orthodox medicine, where you move towards so-called evidence-based medicine. Unfortunately, given the stranglehold that the pharmaceutical companies have on the way in which healthcare is practiced, a lot of EBM isn't really EBM, because negative results are still getting swept under the carpet, and pressure is brought to bear on researchers and the medical journals, and EBM is an aspiration, I would think, rather than a reality at this time. In terms of nutrition, I think it works rather better, because here we've got a series of tests. The balance test is one, but we have others which you can use to monitor yourself. There's no third party involved other than the analytic independent lab that you send the test to. We would have no say in that. We can't access the data. It's fully anonymized under GDPR, the Data Protection Acts. And it's anonymized. So the only person who can access this data, and the only person who knows who the data belongs to, is the user. So there's a complete disintermediation. By that I mean the healthcare professionals aren't involved, unless it's the healthcare professional who's actually doing the test. The insurance companies aren't involved. It's up to you and the lab, and you get to see your result, and then you can make a decision based on that result as to whether you want to take a supplement, continue with a supplement, or not take a supplement. We're handing control over your health back to you, the consumer, the end user, rather than continuing to build medical complexes where the power to make medical decisions is taken further and further away from the individual and given up to the medical system and those people who control it.
Fantastic, Paul. Paul, just as a final out, as we wrap out in the next 2-3 minutes, okay? I know we've been talking about the number one, core part of our body that we talk about is obviously our brain, okay? But the second biggest brain is our gut. The Xenobiotic, which is, I know, one of your favorite products, okay? Just give me a 1-minute quick, just for the wellness people on the call, or the people on the call that want to take care of their health to a further level. Why would somebody want to be doing a prebiotic like the Xenobiotic?
You say the brain's the number one organ. Well, you can't get by without it, but I'd like to see you trying to get by without a pair of kidneys or lungs or a heart. I mean, every part of your body, every organ is really important. That's why we have it. The gut, yeah, sure, it's important. Hippocrates famously said that the origin of all diseases lay in the intestinal system, and what you put into it. And I don't think he was completely right, but certainly there was a great deal in what he said, and modern science is very much backs that up. We now understand that the modern diet leads to something called dysbiosis, which is a totally incorrect population of microbes in the gut. And what was once a friend the healthy microbiota in the gut is part of your immune system. It's part of your digestive system. It speaks to the brain. It speaks to many other tissues, and it works as an absolutely integrated whole. It's part of your protection against disease if you eat a traditional diet. The modern diet has taken some really important compounds out. These are called prebiotic fibers. And now the microbiota, the population of microbes in the gut, particularly mostly in the large bowel, is reconfigured. It's no longer a friend, it's a foe, it is an enemy. It starts producing some really nasty compounds, which can cause serious problems, not just in the gut, but in many other tissues in the body. So what we have done, what I did was to, it was actually a very complicated calculation, putting together a group of different prebiotic fibers that would restore a much earlier, a much more natural microbiota throughout the entire length of the large bowel. And again, we've got huge numbers of people who are now taking this either on its own or as part of the health protocol. And what they find is that the types of problems associated with the modern diet and the wrong population of microbes in the gut, once you rectify that, which Xenobiotic does, all of those problems go away. And I mean all of them.
Yeah, incredible products when you start putting the protocol together, being the balanced oil, balanced test, and then the Xenobiotic, followed by our Extend nutritional product, our incredible, it's just an amazing multivitamin. When you couple all that.
Rob, yeah? It's not a multivitamin. It's not a multivitamin. Multivitamins don't work, and we know that. They've been tested again and again and again. Well, it's a very broad-based micro and phytonutrient support program with a lot of things in it that aren't in classical vitamins or mineral products. So you've got a wide range of key phytonutrients in there. You've got your 1,3,1,6 beta-glucans in there, which are absolutely essential for training your innate immune system. And you have a little pinch of thiocyanates, which might sound rather poisonous, but are in fact essential, absolutely essential for your immune system. So it's a very comprehensive complex. I don't know what to call it because it's the first of its kind. A broad-based micro and phytonutrient support program. It's kind of a network that is designed to take your profile, your nutritional profile, and raise it to the level that we find in the blue zones. You know, like the ones in Sardinia and Icaria, where I've just come back from. In fact, I've been studying the diet there. And the net effect of taking these three things, the health protocol, is to take your metabolism and put it in a time machine and send it back 150 years to a time before the development of the industrial ultra-processed diet. And when that happens, all the health benefits that we associate with that there's more traditional earlier times come to the surface, and they manifest themselves very, very quickly.
So there we go, guys. We've now got the balanced test, number one. Number two, balanced oil, ascent oil. Then you couple it up with the Xenobiotic, the prebiotic fiber, and then our incredible Extend program. That's known as our health protocol. Dr. Paul, as we wrap up now, I want to say thank you so much for coming on the call. I know all the practitioners are on the call, and the people that are going to be listening to this call will just thank you every day for putting this incredible program together, or being part of the medical advisory board that sits there and thinks about the science that's in this whole program to get them marching and walking the right way. I think it's absolutely critical that you've gone to this length to make sure, and thank you for the correction that we don't have the Extend in the Southern Hemisphere yet, so we're waiting for it. So that's probably why I picked that word I did. Okay, but I can see again the science just in the two products that we're selling, the oil and also prebiotics, the Xenobiotic. We've just seen again amazing results. Paul, back to you.
I'd just like to answer a question that's popped up in the chat box from Jeff Oras, who sounds as if he might be a gold bug, which I am too, by the way. Thiocyanate. I don't want you to go off running away with thinking about thiocyanate here. There are cyanogenic compounds in foods. So you have things like glucosinolates that you find in brassica vegetables, and you have the cyanogenic glycosides that you find in some cereals. They release thiocyanates into the body and the bloodstream once you eat them. And that's the route we're taking. We're working with food derivatives.
Fantastic, Paul. Okay, Paul, thank you again so much, my friend. Let's explore again in another couple of months. I love having a conversation with you. 45 minutes with you is just so educational. It is absolutely outstanding. Every time you give us a talk, it just always seems so much better than those recordings, that there's thousands of recordings. drpaulclayton.eu. Jump up and look at the blog site, zenzinotest.com for the Zenzino testing side. And guys, you're going to be armed with a lot of information you can take and use yourself, and also share with anybody that's in your community. Dr. Paul, any closing comments as we close out the call?
All I'll say is that according to the people who publish my blog site, there's something there to annoy everyone.
Fantastic, Paul. Thank you so much. And again, guys, appreciate you all. Share this word to the world. And guys, let's go out and help as many people as possible. Take care. Thank you, Dr. Paul. Have a great night.
My pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Paul.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.